The winter passed, and spring came, and life embraced us back. And we very few who were spared, found help from an unexpected quarter. Help from those very savages we had so feared, from Massasoit and the ever-faithful Squanto. From them we learned how to sow our crops, how to work long hours, where to fish for herring and alewives. We worked in common, men and women, pilgrim and stranger, white man and Indian. And at last the harvest time came, and with it our Thanksgiving.
So we are joined by some special guests, returning guests to the show. We have with us Mahtowin and Kimimila. Can we start by having you all introduce yourself and the organization you're with and where you're calling from?
My name is Mahtowin, as you said, and I'm co-leader of United American Indians of New England and also the lead organizer for the Massachusetts Indigenous Peoples Day statewide movement. And we're speaking to you from Boston.
My name's Kisha. I'm a senior at Wellesley College. I'm president of the Wellesley College Native American Student Association. I'm a volunteer with United American Indians of New England, and my grandfather founded National Day of Mourning.
Thanks for that. Again, it's a pleasure to have you both on here again. So this Thursday is Thanksgiving when most people are listening to this podcast. It's a settler holiday and a national origin story washed in horrific violence. And despite the common trope that the United States is a nation of immigrants, the history of the first Thanksgiving suggests otherwise. Immigrants come to a foreign land to become naturalized within the existing social order. Settlers, on the other hand, come to replace the existing social order. The Pilgrims, for example, departed the Mayflower and founded Plymouth Plantation in 1620, and this year is the 400-year anniversary of that endeavor. But they didn't come to be integrated into the existing indigenous political world. They came to destroy it and to replace it. And in 1637, after the slaughter of more than 700 Pequot women, children, and men, the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, William Bradford, declared the settlers' first Thanksgiving, quote, in honor of the bloody victory, thanking God that the battle had been won, end quote. The massacre and its commemoration set the tone for what was to come, the creation of a nation of colonizers. So with that, I would like to turn it over to our esteemed guest to talk about this 400 years of the Pilgrim mythology and the violence that it has wrought on this land. Maybe you all can start by doing a brief history of the so-called First Thanksgiving, the myth that surrounds it, and why it became such an important or significant holiday for this particular settler nation.
Yeah, sure. So, as you explained, the first Thanksgiving did not take place in 1621. It took place in 1637 to commemorate a literal massacre, and thereafter, massacres would be followed by days of Thanksgiving. But the seeds of sort of the Pilgrim forefather myth began to be planted in the 18th century when a group of Mayflower descendants felt that they were losing cultural relevance, and they were quite angry that Catholic immigrants were coming over and Eastern European immigrants were coming over because they felt that that was a cheaper heritage. And so they began to plant the seeds that the Pilgrims were the forefathers of the nation. And it was very much a way of establishing cultural dominance over newer immigrants, but also establishing sort of Protestantism as the original American religion. And then this idea really caught on, and by the time we get to 1820, the Pilgrims are being called Pilgrims for the first time. They're being called the Pilgrim Forefathers in speeches. And we get to Abraham Lincoln in 1863, who declares Thanksgiving a holiday in order to promote unity during the Civil War. And from there on, we get very much the Pilgrim mythology we see today, where the Pilgrims seeking religious freedom landed on Plymouth Rock. The Indians welcomed them with open arms. They sat down to a harvest meal, and then the Native Americans faded into the background, the end. And of course, we know that that's not really what happened.
And I think this is an important, for this particular commemoration this year, there's been a lot of kind of hoopla, especially with the state of Massachusetts. And I understand Mahtowin and I had a discussion about this earlier, that there is a society that has been created. And I was wondering if you could maybe explain that and the sort of Disneylandification or the Disneyfication of this particular history, and why it is, so important to not only that region, but also to the United States.
Sure. The creation of the national mythology was meant to be a unifying factor for whiteness in this country, and to create a myth that Native people just sort of disappeared into the forest, and everybody lived happily ever after. The concept that is presented, not unlike the concept of Zionism in Palestine, is that there was this empty land basically waiting for the European settlers to arrive here and take it over. This year, there's been a lot of hoopla, as you said, about the Plymouth 400. That is the 400th anniversary of the landing of the Pilgrims. It's not just a local thing. Certainly, the town of Plymouth, Massachusetts, is very much part of a pilgrim-centric tourist industry, and that's very important to them there. Interestingly enough, the Plymouth Rock, which every school child has heard of and imagines to be gigantic, is in fact really small. It's not where the Pilgrims landed at all, and it was voted as the most disappointing tourist attraction in Massachusetts, which we were quite delighted by, actually.
It's the candy corn of national monuments.
So you were probably surprised when you first saw it,
Yeah.
but you must have been
I think I
"Is
tripped
that
over it?
Yeah, it's not a very big deal. But the Plymouth 400 effort is a multi-million-dollar international effort. Actually, there have been all sorts of things happening the last year or so in England, in the Netherlands, and in the U.S. And there's a lot of money behind it. It very much centers the Pilgrims and gives this sort of sunny story about them and their quest for religious freedom. And then there is some indigenous content as well, but of course that's secondary to the Pilgrim story, and is, not. I think it's also in there so that the Pilgrims can, or the Latter-day Pilgrims, I should say, can sort of pretend that everything's fine and there's some reconciliation now, and they're not actually racist. Things are okay, but we're not buying that.
Yeah, it's very much both sidesism, the kind of both sidesism you see in school, where they're still very much upholding the myth of the Pilgrims and the Pilgrim mythology because they don't want to let that go. But we're sort of tacked on as an afterthought, sort of a both sidesism when there can't be both sidesism, when one side is complete historical fiction and the other is complete historical fact.
Mm-hmm. Kisha, you said, your father was a part of the founding of the first day of mourning, I think going back to 1970, where, protesters buried Plymouth Rock, not once, but twice, and boarded a Mayflower replica, took down the Union Jack from the mast and replaced it with the same flag that flew over Alcatraz Island, liberated by Red Power activists. in 1969. And so on the eastern shores of Turtle Island, the Wampanoag people, the people of the First Light, commemorate the genocide and the theft of the continent at Ground Zero with a day of mourning. And subsequently on the western shore at Alcatraz Island, which has its own history, the dawn of a militant era of Red Power protests, indigenous people hold a sunrise ceremony to celebrate that particular history. So I was wondering if you can maybe give us a little bit of a background for people and why the National Day of Mourning began and the kind of contentious history it had locally.
Sure. So my grandfather, Wamsutta Frank James, was president of the Federated Eastern Indian League. He was very much seen as a community leader within the Wampanoag community. And so for the 350th anniversary, a group of Pilgrim descendants really wanted to get together and celebrate their ancestors. And sort of as a last second thought, they asked my grandfather to give a speech at the banquet to give a Wampanoag side of the story. But of course, what they meant by that is they wanted a Wampanoag man to praise the Pilgrims. And they insisted that my grandfather send them a copy of his speech in advance. They claimed it was to check for grammatical and spelling errors, which, number one, it was offensive to my grandfather because he was a school teacher and was able to spell and use grammar perfectly fine. And also, none of the white speakers were asked to submit their speeches in advance. He did so. And the people holding the banquet were, of course, horrified by what he had to say because it was the truth. And so they told him that he could not give the speech, and they said that they would write a speech for him. He refused, and this fight really made local headlines. You see a lot of headlines in Cape Cod. For example, my personal favorite is Wampanoag man says the white man speaks with a forked tongue. I personally really like that one.
Where's the lie?
But anyway, so he and a group of supporters got together and planned the National Day of Mourning. The announcement was sent all over the country to various tribes and indigenous people. And at the very first National Day of Mourning, which was held on November 27th, 1970, there were representatives from over 25 tribes. There were people from the American Indian Movement, people from local tribes, as well as the Federated Eastern Indian League, which later became United American Indians of New England. But it was very contentious. You can see in the archives in 1970 a lot of white people writing editorials about this, saying that the Native Americans are ruining a perfectly good national holiday. It wasn't genocide. Wamsutta Frank James is a liar, sort of all sorts of things like that. But that's the background of National Day of Mourning.
What really happened at the first Thanksgiving? According to popular myth, the Indians and the Pilgrims sat down and had a wonderful dinner. Everyone lived happily ever after. The end. Well, here is the truth. The reason that the myth makers prefer to talk about the Pilgrims and not an earlier English-speaking colony, Jamestown, is that in Jamestown the circumstances were way too ugly to hold up as an effective national myth. For example, the white settlers in Jamestown turned to cannibalism to survive, and that's not a very nice story to tell kids in school. And the Pilgrims did not find an empty land any more than Columbus discovered anything. Every inch of this land is Indian land. The Pilgrims, who did not even call themselves Pilgrims, did not come here seeking religious freedom. They already had that in Holland. They came here as part of a commercial venture. The Mayflower Compact was nothing more than a bunch of white men sticking together to ensure that they would get returns on an investment. They introduced sexism, racism, anti-lesbian and gay bigotry, jails, and the class system to these shores. They were no better than any other group of Europeans when it came to their treatment of the indigenous peoples here. And no, they did not even land at that sacred shrine down the hill called Plymouth Rock, which is a monument to racism and oppression. Upon first arriving, the Pilgrims opened my ancestors' graves and took our corn and bean supplies. Massasoit, the great leader of the Wampanoag, knew this. Yet he and his people welcomed and befriended the settlers, little knowing that before 50 years were to pass, Many Wampanoag and other Indians would be killed by their guns or dead from diseases. And from this very harbor, the English invaders would sell my ancestors as slaves for 220 shillings each.
And today, unfortunately, because of the pandemic, the National Day of Mourning won't be able to hold its traditional kind of in-person gathering, but is instead doing a series of online videos. Can you talk a little bit about the role that you all have played in this current kind of 400-year commemoration? I don't know if is it still going to go forward on the day? What's happening?
Well, all of the amazing plans that the Latter-day Pilgrims had come up with to make money and bring in lots of tourists have sort of fallen apart and are probably mostly delayed until next year because of COVID. So one thing that they did do is that the Mayflower replica was rehabbed and was brought back into port. And in fact, on Thursday, on Thanksgiving Day, there will be some of us in Plymouth.
Okay.
Our National Day of Mourning in-person ceremony is going to be smaller and more limited because of COVID. And we've asked people who come normally from New York and from other places who are, who might need to travel a long distance, not to come. Our biggest concern is that people are safe. And so the crowd will be smaller than normal. As you know, we normally have more than 1,000 people there. But we will be there. And when we're there, we will certainly be marching past the Mayflower replica, and we'll have some words for it, I would say. I know sometimes people talk, one of the hashtags that's around right now is Mayflowers Kill.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's an old joke in Indian country that April showers bring Mayflowers and Mayflowers bring genocide. One of our tragic jokes, I guess.
Yeah.
So we will still be there, but the bulk of the content is in fact going to be online messages from lots of different people, including, I believe, Nick Estes.
Yes, I'm recording my message right after we get off this call. I swear. No, I am. I even took a shower because normally when I do podcast episodes, I don't shower, so I took a shower because I'm like, I got to be on camera.
Thanks for sharing, Nick.
Yeah.
All right. So anyway, it should be, we think because there's going to be so much online content this year, a great thing is that thousands of people are going to be able to not only hear the message of National Day of Mourning, but to hear a lot of different Indigenous perspectives and a lot of information about multiple Indigenous struggles. We couldn't capture every single one that I think we'd like to capture, but we certainly, for instance, we have a message from the 1492 Land Back Lane struggle at Six Nations at the Grand River in so-called Ontario. We have a message from the Mi'kmaq moderate livelihood fishing struggle in Nova Scotia. We have a message coming from Shinnecock out on Long Island in New York State, where they'll be talking about how they're continuing to struggle against the state and against the local town and to reclaim their land and their proper place out there. And we have many other messages. I mean, we, for instance, have somebody from the Honduran Indigenous community speaking about things there. We have a Palestinian brother who's going to be speaking. So we think that anybody who listens to the programming is going to learn a lot, and that's really important to us because a lot of what we're doing with National Day of Mourning for all these 50 years is not only unifying Indigenous people and bringing us all together for something really meaningful to all of us, but it's really educating not only about the history, but about what's happening with Indigenous communities now.
Right. Kisha, you brought up something really interesting. This, this kind of not just this recent fear, but this previous kind of historical fear of losing one's cultural heritage, right? Or the fear of replacement, or what I call the counter annihilation thesis, right? Where it's like we have to destroy these people before they destroy us or overtake us, right? Or essentially, it's basically making invasion look like self-defense. And in this
Yeah.
case, it's like it centers on the protection of monuments and so-called cultural, white European cultural heritage of this country. And I think of this past summer when, you had the taking down not only of Confederate monuments, but also the taking down and the destruction of colonial monuments. And I think there was a lot of confusion because some of them happened to be Union people, right? People who fought for the Union, but nonetheless were Indian fighters and genociders in their own right. And I think this is an important discussion that often gets, reduced to just the Confederacy, right? And for all intents and purposes, like the Confederacy won, because what other nation loses a war, or what other side loses a war and then builds monuments and statues to its generals, its political leaders, etc., in the territory of the victors, right? um, and I was thinking about this in the context of this particular monument, in its location, not only its geographical location in the Northeast, but also its historical location, because it was here as well that the belief or the ideology of American exceptionalism or US exceptionalism emerged. When Kennedy spoke of a free society, beset terror without order and disorder within, or Reagan, the last best hope of man on earth, or Obama, even the meaning of our democracy, they summoned the ghosts of the Puritans, right? And John Winthrop, and who was the leader of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630, who wrote, or who coined the phrase "a city upon the hill," and this became the kind of like lodestar of manifest destiny and westward expansion. Um, are those conversations happening in this commemoration? Has that, how do you see it as connected to the more recent struggle to remove monuments, especially those celebrating colonialism?
I don't feel like those conversations are happening within the frameworks of the Plymouth 400 celebration, obviously. The conversations are certainly happening within the framework of the work that we've been doing, especially in Massachusetts and throughout the region. For instance, to get rid of Columbus Day and instead celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day, and to bring down the Columbus statues, for instance. There's been I will tell you that the Columbus statue that was at Boston Harbor is now down and
Mm.
is not coming back. Not only have Indigenous people been protesting against it for years, but it finally became clear to the people who loved that statue and defended Columbus no matter what, that it was going to continue to be redecorated over and over and beheaded over and over, and that it was just not possible for them to continue to have that out in public the way that it had been. When we go in and talk about any of these issues, first of all, it's really important for us to say that a lot of the conversations that we're able to have now that we weren't able to have a couple of years ago are due to the tremendous opening that's been created by the movement for Black Lives.
Hmm.
There's, a few years ago, when we would say something was white supremacist or talk about white supremacy, everybody in the room was clutching their pearls. Uh, among white people, among settlers. And now I think there's much more common understanding of the term and understanding that there are systems at play here. We always point out, for instance, with things like the Columbus statue or Columbus Day for that matter, that even the Confederate flag has come down in the South, even in Mississippi,
Hmm.
and that Confederate statues are falling all over the South. And yet up here in the Northeast, they're continuing to cling to Columbus for the worst kind of reasons. When we go in and do Indigenous Peoples Day hearings, it's brutal. We have these angry, racist, old Italian Americans who come in and call us savages and cannibals and defend Columbus and say that no, the native people actually loved Columbus because he brought them Christianity and he was kind to them. And they go on and on with that kind of thing. And it gets really ugly. And by the way, I don't mean to disparage all Italian Americans. We also have allies who work with us very closely who are anti-racist Italian Americans who work with us when we're doing Indigenous Peoples Day campaigns on the ground. You know, there's a real ability within the Northeast to point to racism in other places and not to see it here. And there's a real ability to not only overlook racism against our Black siblings, but to completely ignore racism against Indigenous people. And that's something that we've been fighting against all these years and trying to pop holes in that all the time. I think we've made a lot of progress. Every year there's been much more knowledge of National Day of Mourning. I think there's been a lot more rethinking of how history is taught and how things like the Pilgrim invasion are covered in history, how that's taught to our children. And, you know, as a mom, that means a lot to me because really I'm always concerned first with what our children are hearing in schools. It hasn't changed enough. And we also know that there's a huge amount of pushback from the right wing, from the fascists. You know, Trump last summer didn't go to Mount Rushmore by accident. Mm-hmm. You know, that was a clear flag to show his disdain for Indigenous territory, Indigenous sacred land, and to show, you know, that he was going to uphold this mythology of the U.S. And he also did an order shortly after that, which protects a lot of statues, including Columbus statues. It's now, you know, to make it a federal offense to redecorate Columbus statues, for instance, in some circumstances, and certain other kinds of statues. So there's a big pushback from these racist white people, these racist settlers who feel scared and feel threatened that their I don't know if I call what they have a culture, but but that their concept of their culture is going to be pushed aside. And you know, a lot of the things that we're all dealing with on the streets and elsewhere, that's propelled by their feeling that they're somehow threatened by anybody who is not white like them, right?
Mm. You know, you brought up a lot of interesting points, and I think, you know, one of the things that I found really compelling about the National Day of Mourning when I attended was the breadth of internationalism and diversity, and not like, not like the Corntown neoliberal, diversity statements that our universities and other institutions are issuing, but connecting these struggles. And I feel, you know, you talked about this a little bit, Mahtowin, but maybe either of you could talk a little bit more about the connection between Israel and, you know, the United States. And it's not so much the connection just between the two states as it is a connection between the two governing ideologies of Zionism and, you know, manifest destiny, and why those two particular ideologies are so much, you know, linked at the hip, so to speak, and really feed off of each other.
Well, that's entirely true what you say. You know, it's always interesting to look at other settler colonial societies and to see the impact of that on Indigenous peoples. First of all, you know, I'm always interested to learn about what happens to our Indigenous siblings in Australia and New Zealand, and what has happened to our Kanaka Maoli, our Native Hawaiian siblings, for instance, and our relatives in Canada. There's so many similarities. Settler colonialism does, because it is a system, rolls in and does the same thing over and over again to the Indigenous people there. I think the parallels between the US and Zionism in Palestine are remarkable. And I think it's why there are so many Indigenous people who feel a deep bond of solidarity with the Palestinian people. Because you can see everything happening right now in front of you. There's nothing hidden about what's happening there at all. And the way that everything is set up here to make it seem as though Zionism is good, to make it seem as though, for a long time, to make it seem as though Palestinians were somehow undeserving to live on their own homelands. All of the things that have happened and that have been said, and the propaganda that we've all been subjected to, when you look at it through an Indigenous prism, it all comes together and makes sense. And it's horrifying. And I think it's why, there's so many of us Indigenous people who really want to reach our hands out to our Palestinian siblings and have relationships with them, and to help here to bring their struggle forward against the kind of propaganda that has been going on for decades now.
And you see a lot of parallels between obviously the narratives that the US and Canada spin about Indigenous people and Israel spins about Palestine. So, for example, I've been seeing a lot of governments and white people in general in both the United States and Canada referring to Indigenous people as terrorists. And you see that same rhetoric, obviously, in Israel. And one of the greatest Palestinian hip hop songs from the early 2000s is a song entitled "Who's the Terrorist?" Which really interrogates sort of that whole mentality. And, Israel comes in and they bomb and they kill, but somehow Palestinians are the terrorists for fighting back or, for throwing stones. And then the other thing I've been thinking about a lot this year is the concept of Terra Nullis, this idea that, there's sort of this blank slate and no people were here, or if there were people here, they weren't doing anything with the land. And obviously you see that with the Pilgrim mythology, where you have the line where the Indians welcome them with open arms, which implies that the Native Americans somehow handed over their land willingly to the Pilgrims. And you see that very much in narratives about Palestine as well, where it's a lot of, well, the British gave, the Israelis Israel, and as if that was somehow like Britain's place to give that. So yeah, lots of parallels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think of how the kind of horror of the first so-called Thanksgiving. It was accompanied by this brutal massacre, and then of course the subsequent massacres as well. And I would say that Thanksgiving, as the United States celebrates it, is on par with something like the Nakba, or the catastrophe, right? The expulsion of Palestinian people from their homelands. I think about 250,000 were expelled. Within the so-called founding of the state of Israel, through the invasion. And that was like a very kind of like historic moment. And today it's celebrated as like the Independence Day of Israel, or the founding. It's like their national holiday that they get around and celebrate as well. But it's premised on the expulsion, dispossession, and elimination of the Palestinian people. And I also was thinking in this particular moment, there's a tendency, and I'd like to hear both of your thoughts on this. There's a tendency to say like, well, if we take down the statue, or we stop saying, Indian, or stop saying the S word, we can, or the R word, right? We'll change a football team name. We'll throw some brown faces in high places, but we're not really committed to kind of changing the material relationship between the United States and Indigenous people, which is fundamentally land. And so what is what is the National Day of Mourning, have to do with the more recent struggles to get land back? I know Mahtowin named several of the struggles who are, Land Back Lane and Six Nations, and there was other ones that are ongoing right now. But where's the the connection here? Where's the intersection?
So every year at National Day of Mourning, we say that we're standing on liberated territory, that our presence liberates the territory, which is sort of a form of land back.
I think some of the things that we work on are symbolic.
Mm-hmm.
Getting people to understand history is educational, but there are things that we work on that are symbolic. Bringing down a Columbus statue can be said to be symbolic. Bringing down the obelisk in Santa Fe can be said to be symbolic, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that symbolism is important, but it's just a very minor beginning in addressing things. It's not the end. And it makes me think a lot about how I see a lot of institutions now suddenly doing land acknowledgments in the US. They've been doing them in Canada for a little while longer, especially since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where thousands of people testified about the devastation of their families and communities at the hands of the Canadian government and the residential schools there. Very painful. And so I think a lot of places in Canada started to do land acknowledgements, universities, and even public school systems and things like that. And it's catching on more here now. But I feel like institutions sometimes think that they can do something symbolic like that, and then that's an end to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've really been pointing out that it should only be a very first step. If you stop celebrating Columbus Day and instead celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day, if you do a land acknowledgement, you need to develop relationships with Indigenous communities. If you're an academic institution, Kisha is president of the Wellesley College Native American Students Association. I'm not going to talk for her, but I will say that they've really been pressuring the institution to recruit more Indigenous students and to hire Indigenous faculty. There's not a single Indigenous faculty member there. And I'm not going to talk more about it because it's her story. But, a lot of other changes need to be made. And I would say that's also especially true for land grant institution universities, uh, who are, of course, on stolen Indigenous land. But I think that it's really important for all these institutions to really examine what their role is in stealing native land and continuing to benefit from that, in benefiting from the extraction and theft of resources on Indigenous land, the fact that they usually have no relationship with the Indigenous nations on whose land they sit. Um, they're up to their ears in our blood, really.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that they need to examine. And I think there need to be some serious reparations. I think, everybody's been talking about, I think land back has become more of a slogan the last couple of years. The idea was always there. All of us
Mm-hmm.
always wanted our land back, Nick.
Mm-hmm.
That nobody ever said, "Oh, that's okay. You took 10,000 acres and we have 160 acres left, but we're cool with that. That's good." Like no Indigenous person ever really said that, right? So, but I think land back to me is where do you start with that? First of all, there's all these public lands
Mm-hmm.
in that are held by the federal government and also held by the states. There are a lot of public lands held by the states in the eastern part of the country, for instance. All of that land could immediately go under the control of the appropriate Indigenous nations. Immediately.
Yeah, this is fuck the national parks.
Yeah.
AKA fuck the national parks.
Yeah.
But I think it's also a matter of looking at and thinking about who gets to make decisions about the land. I think settlers are scared by the concept of land back, because what do they say? They say, "Oh, are you going to put us all on reservations?" And and we're like, no, because we're not assholes like European invaders. Thank you. Actually, but they're very fearful that it's going to upend their lives, and also that it would cause some discomfort and cause them to lose money and things like that. So I think what we're talking about in it is really about who gets to make decisions about the land and what happens on the land. And some this year when I've been talking to college students, I've actually been saying that everybody just needs to decolonize or die, and which I think some people find a shocking kind of slogan, and perhaps it is, but I think the issue here now is that we're running out of time. And and we all know we're running out of time. We don't have time to wait for Biden to decide that a Green New Deal that works slowly and upholds capitalism is going to be the way to go. We're running out of time. And the young people know it. Young people over and over again look at me and talk about how they're disheartened and scared and have all sorts of feelings about, if there's a future for them because of what's happening with the climate collapse. And so when I say decolonize or die, I'm really saying you have to listen to Indigenous people. You have to let Indigenous values and people make decisions about the land, because listen, we've got Indigenous people who support fracking. I'm not saying we're all perfect. Okay. I want to be clear about that. We're not romanticizing about this, but generally we're going to make better decisions about the land, and we're going to make better decisions that will help, along with our Black siblings, that will help us to reach some liberation here and will help us to begin to address issues of climate justice that so desperately need to be addressed. So that's the kind of thing we're thinking about.
Yeah, I think the fear that's projected onto Indigenous people is really just what it is, projection. It's a projecting of what settler society did to Indigenous people, even if there isn't an explicit acknowledgement that genocide happened and that theft, or genocide is happening and that theft has happened and is continuing to happen, that their solution is so apocalyptic that to reverse it would be to do the exact same thing. And it does several things. First of all, to my mind, it's like, it says that, Indigenous people were just kind of like closed societies and very parochial, like local cultures that didn't really have any concern about the world or different people, which is historically not the case at all. And that assumes that we are somehow, if you can't imagine what came before the United States, then you're basically saying that Indigenous people had no history, right?
Right.
And to me, that's an incredibly cynical view of not only this land, but also just like what the future holds. And I think you are right in the sense that, like, our slogan that we took up for the Red Deal is decolonization or extinction. And it's not just we're facing the sixth mass extinction event, and this includes human beings as well, as part of that, and also human cultures that are on the chopping block. And so we understand that, and also that it just can't be this kind of like, lily white northern led kind of project, when in fact a lot of our, this is why I appreciated the perspectives that are always offered at the National Day of Mourning, around, like, especially the global South. Like, there are real legitimate movements that are for climate justice, but are not interested in upholding the consumer society of the North and the pillaging of their lands, to sustain that level of consumption. And in the North, and especially Indigenous peoples who are part of the United States, but not entirely of it in many ways, we don't have those same kind of consumption problems, right? In fact, we underconsume, right, in many respects. And so, I think, again, Thanksgiving is, something that I feel like it's premised on genocide and consumption, like the worst of, consumer culture, right? When in fact indigenous people themselves often give thanks. It's like, have you ever gone to a Lakota like giveaway? Like they give away everything.
Literally, yeah.
Yeah, literally everything. It was like the first thing they banned, they made illegal, was giveaways. I had a question for Kisha, and this is something I've seen a lot in your work online. And I would like to hear your thoughts on this. So, in 1623, there was Conbitan. I don't know if I'm saying their name correctly, who was a Wampanoag leader. Um, and they asked, like, if your love is great and it grows such good fruit, then why are you always pointing guns at us, basically? And Winslow, had come to this particular settlement, this particular Wampanoag settlement, uninvited, and asked, he's like, take me to your leaders. And, Combatant pointed to his partner, who was a non-man, and he said, this person's name is not mentioned in the journals other than Winslow calling them Squaw Sachem. Like, that's a literal quote. Excuse my language. So in the Puritan world, women and non-men were subservient to men. In the Wampanoag world, women and non-men were leaders. And they were honored with the title of Sansquas. If I think I'm not entirely pronouncing that correctly, this is me doing research. But since invasion, settlers have distorted that meaning to usurp non-men's authority over the land. And the word squaw, and this is a slur, and I just want to point that out to people. Don't say that. And it warped from its original purpose and has become used to sexualize and racialize indigenous women and non-men as rapeable and killable. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of specifically indigenous authority that's not grounded in heteropatriarchy, especially when it comes to leadership.
Sure. So, obviously, Mahtowin and I are both not men. So, starting with us, we're not, National Day of Mourning is not rooted in the patriarchy. We actually really make a point to have as many women speakers or non-male speakers on as possible. And then also, what you've seen online from my work is I go to Wellesley College, which is a historically women's college. Obviously, we no longer are just women. But, I am a female Indigenous leader, and I've seen that, in like spaces oftentimes were not respected. For example, when we go to demonstrations or we go into Indigenous Peoples Day meetings, um, white people tend to look for male leadership, and when they don't find any, they become very angry at us. We've been physically assaulted by some of these people who don't really respect women or non-men. So yeah, that's sort of my experience as a non-male Indigenous activist.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of representation, even some banners that I saw at National Day of Mourning explicitly acknowledging, LGBTQ and Two-Spirit relatives and their central role in this particular, struggle.
Well, we have Two-Spirit leadership in
Mhm.
United American Indians of New England, and I think that one of the banners you're referring to is a sort of a golden oldie that has somehow survived all the street wars it's been in. I mean, I don't know. I respect old banners who've been through a lot. They kind of mean a lot to me sometimes. And we have one that has been around since the 80s that says homophobia is not native to these shores.
Mm.
And when we first rolled that out, there were a couple of reasons. One is because we wanted to affirm and uplift LGBTQ2S people in our own communities. That was very important, and there was really a lot of homophobia directed and transphobia directed against people from our own community. So it was important for us to say, we'd been saying it before then, but to put out this banner saying that it was not native to these shores, because we felt it was important to remind many Indigenous people of that fact, and that homophobia was not okay. We also did it to send a message that at the time was, I think, very meaningful, important, because it was not very well known, so that people would begin to understand that homophobia is not natural. It was something that was imported along with the Europeans and their Christianity and their other beliefs, and that these are not values that belong here on our lands.
And in the 1990s, when that banner was rolled out, and sort of, I guess it was also the 80s when that was rolled out, there was actually quite a bit of pushback from the local Indigenous community that were accusing National Day of Mourning of sort of going against tradition, as if women were and non-men were not present at the first National Day of Mourning. But we got a lot of editorials saying things like, it used to be about Wampanoag struggles, but now they've let the lesbians in, stuff like that. So we definitely have gotten a lot of pushback over the years, not just for that, but also for centering non-local Native voices as well.
Can you talk a little bit about that pushback and what it looks like, not only from the the Plymouth community, which is, I've been there, and it's like a resort town basically, and it's expensive to go. Like it's so weird. It's like there's a reason why most of the horror movies are filmed in places like the Northeast, or so-called New England, because it is a freaking horror show.
But yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed your year up here, Nick.
Oh my god, it was actually really depressing. I'm not gonna lie, I don't hide that very well. It was so depressing.
Well, plus you were at Harvard. I mean, I live up here and I never set foot at Harvard. I hate it so much.
It's like colonial. I was really grateful for the privilege of having the opportunity to be there, and I loved the archives, everything else. But other than that, it was like I had encountered more racism there than I had in since I moved away from South Dakota. When I would tell people that, they would look at me like I was I was an alien or something that just walked off of a UFO.
Yes, we get that all the time. And in fact, when we go into towns, including Cambridge, by the way, for the Indigenous people stuff to do the hearings there, I swear they look at us like we dropped in from outer space. Mm-hmm. And we've been asked over and over again if we're extinct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the settlers sit there with beady little eyes and sort of look at us and accuse us of putting Indian curses on them and whatnot. So.
True story. Which we do. No.
Listen, everybody's grown up with a lot of nonsense, and a lot of Christianity has been shoved into Indigenous minds. Not everybody has been fortunate enough to grow up in their culture, or has been fortunate enough to grow up relatively free of Christian ideas, things like that. So it's taken a while, and will continue to take a while in some situations for people to shed some of those beliefs, and we're just helping to push that along, shall we say.
And any backlash within your own communities, I think there's kind of a tendency to even within the land back struggle for Haisapa and the Black Hills, there are people who are really critical of people like me who take a position of, we don't want, the Black Hills are not for sale. We will take nothing short of return, as if that's unreasonable. And it's it's actually what the law says, it's not like I'm, but they'll say, they'll say things like, well, the solution is to take the money, because it could be used for things. And like, I agree, but it's like, it shouldn't be an either or scenario. And so there are tensions, within that movement. And I think it's important to, the way that, the reason why I'm asking this is because in this particular political climate, it might be opportune to align oneself with the more quote unquote moderate, elements of like the Democratic Party, let's say, because there might be political opportunity for Indigenous people to gain representation. And oftentimes, I mean, we're already seeing this, is that there tends to be a punch left,
Yeah, listen, the Black Hills have to be returned, period.
Mhm.
I have never thought that was negotiable.
Mhm.
And I understand some people say, oh, take the money, but they have to be returned. I mean, land back does, it means land back. And I think there's a couple of things. One is respectability. All of our training and education is for us to be respectable. And I still see it in a lot of Indigenous youth. They've been so taught to act proper and to be respectable and don't say anything offensive and that kind of thing. You don't want to offend the white people. And that's a mentality that has really been laid down on us to a big extent. And it's something that people have to overcome. I think that there's been a fear for a long time, for good reasons, that if people don't act like good little Indians, that the government is going to be even more cruel to them than they already are.
Mhm.
And so people have fears about those things. So if you want to talk about the government and representation, Kisha might like to do a rant about Biden because she likes to do that anyway. But I guess I'll tell you what my perspective is. It I'm not against representation.
Mhm.
It's not that I don't think it's bad for Indigenous people to be elected to office and things like that. But I think the issue is this: we can have, let's say that 2% of elected officials are Indigenous. That is not going to change the system. It's people elected into a settler colonial system that is set up to be white supremacist and that is set up to oppress Indigenous people.
Mhm.
Period. I don't think I'm being creative when I say that. I think that's just factual. So the representation ultimately doesn't change enough things because the system is so rotten to its very core. The entire foundation of this system is rotten. I guess I think that there's a big push now, which is not the first time such a push has happened, for us to have a seat at the table.
Oof.
And and I guess I would say, having watched waves of this before historically, and well, I haven't seen all of them because I'm not that old, but um, it's been something that ebbs and flows. I guess I personally feel, I understand why some people feel that's the road to go. And certainly people are very heavily indoctrinated in school to believe that you have to vote, and that, like, there's all this nonsense about, if you don't vote, you don't have a right to have an opinion or complain, and all this other.
As if voter suppression isn't a thing in this country, first of all.
Mhm.
So
There's all this things. There's all these things that get pushed down on people. So I understand that, but it's not effective. And
Mhm.
I guess I would say I don't want to be at that table. I think the table's bad. I would like to burn down the table.
Yep.
And and I think that we need to build, I don't know if it's a table, but we need to build something that has more of a basis in Indigenous and Black realities, and in realities of poor and working people, and things like that. So I don't agree with the table, and I'll tell you one of the reasons I think of that. And I'm sorry to speak for so long about this, but you know, as a Lakota person, a lot of us are heavy duty sovereigntists. As you know,
Mhm.
we believe very much in defending our sovereignty. I can also say, though, that I was very influenced by the Mohawk Warrior Society and by the
Mhm.
writings of Louis Hall, the great Louis
Mhm.
Hall. And Louis Hall talking, and I didn't understand at the time how fortunate I was to meet him, but I was able to meet him at one point. And he spoke about the two-row wampum treaty. And he talked about how the entire idea was that the Europeans would stay in their boat, right? And that we would stay in our canoe, and we would have our separate courses as separate peoples, and that we would not interfere with each other. And he said that what happens is when Native people try to have one foot in the canoe and one foot in the white man's boat, they fall into the water and drown.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a simple thing, but I think that has had a big impact. And so it makes me feel, and it's why you see a lot of Six Nations people don't necessarily participate in elections, because they say, and we've seen that with other Native nations, they say, well, I am a member of my own nation. I'm not, I don't need to vote in US systems because these are foreign colonial systems imposed on us. And I don't need to vote in that. What I need to do is, instead of spending all my time collecting votes for somebody who doesn't even care about us, like Joe Biden, instead of spending all our time focused on settler systems, we need to build our own communities and repair our own communities. And so I think that's my perspective more than being really involved in the elections, honestly. But I'm going to let Kisha talk and say what she wants to say.
Well, I was just going to add on where there's the boat canoe metaphor, but sort of, what do you do when the people in the boat are destroying the world and making it so that like you can't go anywhere in your canoe? And I think a lot of Native people sort of have the idea that like, oh, the way to stop that European boat from destroying the world is by voting and is by participating in their systems, when the only course of action is really to, sink that boat in the water, is sort of how I look at it. But I do think that, there's just a lot of indoctrination intentionally, because the United States, of course, knows that it doesn't want to grant us anything other than bourgeois freedom, where we have the freedom, of course, to choose between Pepsi and Coke and, stuff like that. But we have no say over our the actual course of our destinies. And I think sort of keeping the populace underfoot in the electoral system is just one way of making sure that there's never an uprising, because we have the illusion of free choice in this bourgeois system.
Yeah, I agree with both of you on a lot of this. I think for me, it's like, it's not so much, getting a seat at the table. It's like, get that damn table off of my land.
There you go. There you go. Well, but so we're full of tables and canoes and boats right now. I don't know.
We're carpenters. I don't even know. We're shipbuilders, whatever. I think the points that you both raise are incredibly important, because it's as if like that becomes the only alternative. And again, like, this is a politics of cynicism. This isn't, elections aren't democracy. You have to disentangle electoralism from democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and I think that's important. Voting isn't sacred, like,
right.
Let's be real here. Like, I think, again, like, representation is incredibly important, right? Having like an indigenous socialist who was a union leader, the president of, the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere, is a monumental achievement for indigenous people and should be celebrated. His overthrow and return and the restoration of that indigenous socialist project back to power should also be celebrated, but it's not. Like, and it's not, the elections weren't democracy in that instance. What was democracy is people shutting down the country, shutting down the economy, and saying, this cannot take place anymore. And they were massacred and they were killed. Like, they didn't die for the right to vote. They died, on the path to freedom, right? And there's a tendency I see in this particular moment, with the the Biden election and the diversification of U.S. empire, whatever, is like, even, and Mahtowin and I were having this conversation earlier, where it's like, even have somebody like Justin Trudeau, who made promises that he broke at least, but Biden hasn't even made promises to Indigenous people. Like, I don't, he doesn't even, even in his administration, when he was like VPs, like it was not a thing for him. And even if we do get representation in that, we are more likely to get a corporate Democrat that's palatable, not to Indigenous people, but to the power structure.
Mhm.
That's not progress.
Mm-mm.
That's actually setting us back, because that becomes the aspiration, is incorporation within the very system that's killing us, not a return to like a radical politics where the horizon of liberation goes beyond the settler state, right? And I think what Matowi brought up earlier, and what you're talking about, Kisha, is that there's a sense of we can get some kind of reprieve from the very people who stole our land, or we can get reprieve from the very people who are perpetrating the violence against us in the first place. So, where do we go from here? Like, and what role does something like the National Day of Mourning and the project that you both are part of and have, carried forth from your ancestors, where does that take us in this coming in 2021 and beyond?
Well, I want to say with Bolivia that it it's incredible what people went through there the last year. The violence and torture that they were subject to, the violence that they experienced, and the way that they've been able to overcome and have the MAS properly re-elected, and Evo Morales being able to return to the country. That's really inspiring. You know, more than half of their population is indigenous. The
Mm-hmm.
circumstances are different there, and I think that's important to remember. When I think about revolution in elections, when I think about real social change in elections, I always think of the example of Chile, unfortunately. And, in Chile, they thought that they could vote for socialism. And of course, the US intervened and Allende was killed. Many people were killed, and a dictatorship was installed. And, I think that what we can do is build understandings and alliances among each other. I really feel that the work and the conversations happening with Indigenous and Black communities are really important right now. I think that having ties of solidarity with many different struggles helps to pull us all forward. And I think trying to recenter Indigenous voices, as we have been doing for a long time, and as many other people are doing in their work too, certainly not just us, is key um, to getting non-Native people to understand where we're coming from, and to begin to support and understand why they need to make changes in their understandings of their realities here in this land called the United States.
And I do feel, sort of to answer your question of, how does National Day of Mourning fit into all of this, that we all need to start being more like my grandfather, where if you think about it, his refusal to give a speech at that banquet was him refusing to participate in a colonial system.
Mm-hmm.
And so we all need to stop participating in colonial systems, stop trying to get a place at the table. They were literally offering him a place at a table, and he turned it down because it was not on his own terms. And I think we all need to sort of start our own personal National Day of Mourning, whatever it is, whatever struggle you care about. I don't mean like literally start your own protest unless you want to, but just speak truth to power and stop participating in colonial systems, and force America to look at itself in the mirror and realize how ugly it is.
Mm. Yeah, I think this should be a moment of reflection and deep soul searching for not just individuals, but an entire society that's premised on our destruction. And you can't just not celebrate Thanksgiving and expect the world to change, or teach your children about these things, because we know knowledge alone has never just changed the world, nor has it ever overthrown imperialism.
Mhm.
But it requires a critical consciousness, and the will to organize, to change our reality, because simply no one else will do that for us. And I do agree, and I'll push back on you a little bit, Montowi, about Bolivia, is that I do agree that the fact that more than half their population is indigenous, but not only are they indigenous, they're also organized, you know,
Absolutely.
very organized, and not just around the kind of the politics of indigeneity as we have come to know them in the United States, the ones that are just like the culturalist elements, but they've organized around the very kind of means upon which wealth is built in that country, which includes both land and labor. And I think that's what makes, and that's why Evo Morales, when he became president, he said, I'm not, he said, I'm not the first indigenous president. He's like, I'm the first union leader to become
Mhm.
president, right? And some people see that as a slight to indigeneity, but it's like, if you're a union leader in Bolivia, you're probably indigenous, right? So
Mhm.
but yeah, thank you both for coming on to the show again. I know that you all are incredibly busy. But before we go, I want you to tell us where we can find your work, especially the video project. We'll be posting it in the show notes. But for those of our listeners who can't access them, or who are driving or whatever, um, where can they find the National Day of Mourning videos? But then also, what's the best way they can support the projects that you're working on?
Okay, so we're going to have live streaming from multiple places on Thursday, as well as the pre recorded content online at multiple places. It's going to be probably, I would say, at least a 3 hour program altogether. It'll be live streamed from our website, uaine.org. UAINE is for United American Indians of New England.org. And it will also be um, on our Facebook group. It will be at a couple of other websites as well. So there'll be multiple ways for people to be able to listen to it. And after it's all over, in addition, we have a wonderful person who's helping with the live streaming and helping us put everything together, named Sunny Singh from Hate 56. And Sunny is going to sort of put everything together after the fact, so that we'll be able to upload the entire program to our website, so that people will be able to take a look at it after the fact too. Um, I think there's a lot of things that people can do to acknowledge National Day of Mourning on Thursday. Um, it's something that you can talk with your families about if you are having a meal with your family. I know this year it's harder for a lot of
Mhm.
families to get together because of COVID, but yeah, people are still zooming and doing other stuff, I reckon. So it's good to talk about that, and not only to talk about it from a perspective from here, but to talk about it from your own perspective in your own Indigenous community, of what that means to you. Or if you're not Indigenous, to talk about how you grew up with these lies and mythology, and what you can do to try to undo some of that, whether it's within your own family or your own community or what have you. Um, so we encourage people to do things like that, and we also really encourage people to support Indigenous led organizations, not organizations that are backed by churches, not organizations that are largely led by white people and claim to speak for us or represent us, but Indigenous led organizations. And there's so many people doing great work, not only the Red Nation, there's so many organizations devoted to missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two Spirits, to combating domestic violence directed against Indigenous people, to getting land back, to working on food sovereignty. I could just go on and on, as you know, to language reclamation projects. So we encourage, if people are able to contribute time or money to Native-led organizations that are doing meaningful work, that would be really meaningful and important for you to do that. And last but not least, we really encourage non-Native people to begin to understand whose land they're on, and to see what they can do to support local Indigenous struggles. Not to lead them and not to speak for Native people, but to help support. And I'm sure that there's a lot of things that people can do in many areas.